Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast. My name is Joey Schultz and I'm joined as always by my fantastic co-hosts. First up, he's the guy who's always gonna be mixing up the 8 different arts for the new Teferi from Core 21. That's Matt Morgan.
Joey, I want you to know that I absolutely hate it when you ask me, are you listening to me? It's such a rude way to start a conversation.
That's well done, Matt. But I have to admit, I don't know that I was listening when you told that joke.
You can't use my own joke against me. I just used that. It's too fresh.
I must. I absolutely must. Next, the guy who didn't know that the new Teferi had like 8 different arts and is now sweating to try and figure out which one of them he wants in foil. That's Dana Roach.
Yeah, I had no idea. I had family together at my house this weekend for a couple of combined birthday parties, which meant I had 3 children under the age of 5 in my house, and I am now ready to be quarantined for the rest of 2021. Maybe 2022 and 2023 as well.
Just mailing it in.
I'm good. I'm done.
Accurate. Dana, nothing you've ever said in your life has ever resonated more with me than what you just said.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is the EDHRECast. EDHREC is the best deck building resource on the web for the Commander format, compiling data from deck lists all over the internet to provide helpful recommendations for new Commander decks. And here on the EDHRECast, what we like to do is give all that data a little more context. Hey, fellas, what are we talking about this week?
This week, we're going to talk about finding all the different types of setup cards, and more importantly, finding the payoff cards and how many you should have in your deck.
Yeah, we want to take a look at the sort of formula for a deck or sort of a deck building template and really interrogate the ratios between a deck's setup cards and the payoff cards, the cards that lob up the strategy for the deck and then the ones that spike it down and really make it really tick and end those games and make it awesome. We want to take a look at some of those numbers there. But before we get to our main topic, we of course have to give an enormous thank you to Josh Lequai and the folks over there at the Command Zone podcast who handle all of the post-production work on the podcast and make it look as spiffy as it does. It's awesome work. We appreciate them so much. Thank you guys. And of course, we want to give an enormous thank you to the sponsors of the show too.
Yeah, I would like to thank our sponsors, Card Kingdom and TCG Player. Card Kingdom has one of the best, most comprehensive buy lists available, and TCG Player has an almost limitless selection of cards from a countless array of vendors. We all use both, and by clicking through the links on EDHREC, you help support both the site and the show.
We also do want to plug, because I hear, I can't confirm, but I hear that we are streaming Wednesday nights. Apparently, I've heard that somewhere along the grapevine, but
it might be from us having plugged it like 8 or 9 or 18 or 19 times per episode.
Several times. Twitch.tv/EDHRECast. We are indeed streaming Wednesday nights around 7 o'clock Mountain Standard Time. Time zones are weird, all 3 of us being in different time zones, but it is a way for us to get to play games together during this weird time. But also, we get to have some fantastic guests on. We just had Tappy Toe Claws on, cosplayer extraordinaire. Well, actually, I wasn't sure if it was Oko or Jace or Raul Zarek. I think it was Tappy Toe Claws. Pretty sure. Couldn't quite
I think
tell.
it was actually a T-Rex.
It was a T-Rex squawking the whole way along. But yes, twitch.tv/EDHRECast, Wednesday nights where we'll be streaming every week.
Awesome stuff. Yeah, it's been really great. We've had some awesome guests on there. But also, real quick before we get to the main set, the main topic, around this time, the full set. At the time of recording, the full set of Core 21 is not fully previewed. We don't know all the cards in it just yet. We are really excited to talk about it, though, and I just want to take a quick moment to address that because a lot of folks will probably be talking about it. We won't be able to record that until our next week's show, but oh my goodness, Core Set 21 has me so excited, and I really cannot wait until we get the full preview so that we can start talking about that set, because guys, I am blown away by this Core Set, and I just wanted to throw that out there since we can't talk about it just yet on this episode.
It is looking super fantastic. I'm very excited as well. The reprints are amazing. All the new cards are so great. Like, you can play Tribal Hondens now with all the new shrines that are coming out. I could not be more excited. It's such a great set just all around. We have said on the stream you could take out the new cards and all the reprints would carry the set, and we've said that you could take out all the reprints and all the new cards would carry it, and that does not happen very often, let alone in a core set.
Yeah, I think we were really impressed with the core set last year as well, and it's outdone last year's core set. They've just clearly figured out how to do core sets.
Yeah, there are some uncommons from this set that I'm more excited about than some mythic rares that we got from previous sets, and even from like other Commander products. And that is really, really something. I'm really, really excited for the set, so I can't wait to talk about it. But it can't be this week just yet because we don't know all the cards just yet. But I'm really looking forward to it. There's one more thing that we want to plug as well before we get to our main topic, and that is that if you are interested in becoming a writer for EDHREC, if you're interested in creating articles and Magic content on the EDHREC website, we've got a link that you can visit.
Yeah. Our team is expanding and our content is growing, which means we need new people to help write for the site. We're looking for new content creators, more people to write articles. So if you are interested in joining the EDHREC roster, you can go to edhrec.com/apply or email us at social@edhrec.com for more information on how you can join us in writing for the website.
Yeah, awesome stuff. We're really looking forward to it. And now, guys, let's move on to our main topic. We are talking about setup and payoff. So basically, strategies are really never monolithic. A deck doesn't ever do just one thing. There are multiple parts to it. And the Command Zone and Prof from the Tolarian Community College have come up with a couple of different deck building templates or formulas in the past that are really good guidelines. So using Prof's most recent video, which we will provide a link to in the description, it was a really great video, an awesome team effort, and he walks through how to build a deck using EDHREC. It's really awesome. We highly recommend it. He has a formula in there that is roughly the following breakdown. He recommends about 37 to 38 lands for your deck, about 10 or more ramp sources, 10 or more draw sources, about 6 to 8 single target removal spells, and at least 5 board wipes. And then here's the really elusive category: 30 or more synergy cards, things that really synergize with what your deck is going to be up to. And it's that last category that we really want to dive deeper into during this particular episode, because there are kind of different categories within that synergy that we really need to inspect a little bit closer, because they often involve a two-step process where you set up what your deck is going to do, and then you have individual cards that will help pay it off, sort of like in volleyballs. One part of the deck is going to lob it, and then the other one is going to spike it down and help you win the game with that strategy. So that's what we would like to discuss in this episode.
See, I would more prefer to discuss alley-oops because I'm more of a basketball person, but I can do a volleyball analogy. I can live with that.
Matt, just be proud that I understood any sports analogy at all.
That is a good point. I do appreciate your effort.
Like if this was bowling, it'd be the person who passes you the beer.
The bartender. Very important.
Right, yes, there we go. Okay.
See, now you've lost me again. Oh man, guys.
Well, let's get this back on the rails then. So let's talk about this first commander here. So the first one we're going to talk about is Gavi Nest Warden.
Yeah, let's look at some specific commanders and see what the halves of the deck are looking like. Gavi Nest Warden is our first one here. This is the new Jeskai commander, 5 mana, 2/5 human shaman, who allows you to pay 0 rather than paying the cycling cost of the first card that you cycle each turn. And whenever you draw your second card each turn, you create a 2/2 red and white dinosaur cat creature token. So there's some interesting numbers when we started looking at the average deck according to the data compiled by EDHREC. We started looking into it to see how many cards help enable that strategy and also how many turn that strategy into something a little bit more lethal. So when we pulled up some of the average deck information based off of all of that aggregated data for Gavi, we saw that the deck usually contains an average of 44 cards with a cycling ability in a Gavi deck. So really, the typical stuff that you would expect. The Raugrin Crystal can cycle, the Dismantling Wave can cycle, the new card Neutralize can cycle, all of those types of things. But then the second half is what's kind of interesting. We're counting here specifically the number of cards that take the act of cycling a card or the act of drawing or discarding a card to push Gavi towards a very meaningful victory. Matt, how many of those did we find in the average Gavi deck?
So typically, as far as we can tell, the average deck is running about 10 of those payoff cards. Now, you can look at either Flying Shark and the Shark Rider, Braylon and Shabraz. You can look at Locust God and consider that a payoff card, or even your Glinthorn Bucket. I hear that's a very powerful card. Glinthorn Buccaneer, excuse me. Joy had me all confused. Or even one of my favorites, Psychosis Crawler. Those are the types of cards that are benefiting from you either cycling cards, drawing extra cards, discarding card, whatever it is. But those are the cards that you want in play as you're doing some of those cycling abilities and churning through your deck.
Right, and that's a really interesting ratio, I think. 44 cards that help Gavi cycle through, and then about 10% of the deck is the kind of stuff that will actually make all of those cycling cards lethal. And there's actually one other data point that I wanted to hover on here for a moment, which I found really interesting, because the original precon for Gavi had only 31 cards with a cycling ability, which is, I think, one of the reasons why I was a little, I don't know, distrusting of Gavi. The experience that I've had playing against that precon, it always has felt like she just completely stumbles and she totally runs out of gas. And I think that this is kind of a big reason why the average Gavi player is dramatically increasing the number of cycling cards within the deck to make sure that it never runs out of steam that way and that you've always got something to do, because it's nearly half of the deck can cycle to continue that train going. And just having a third of the deck is not quite enough. But yeah, about nearly half the deck can cycle, and then you've got another 10 cards that help you move things on. And this, for the record, actually isn't even including maybe some other wheel spells that might be in the deck, such as windfall effects that also help you draw and discard lots of cards to make those things move. But that is a really interesting ratio that we wanted to touch on, because that is kind of giving you a good impression of how much setup you need to make sure that those payoffs are truly lethal, I think.
And it's not a number that I don't think you can apply to every deck, or maybe not even to the Gavi deck in particular. It's very much an art and not a science in terms of how many of those cards that get you to the point where you can get a payoff, how many enablers you have in your deck. And you mentioned it, Joey, it didn't feel right when you were playing that Gavi deck out of the box, and looking at the numbers, people have clearly added way more cyclers in till it does feel right for them. It's the kind of thing that I think you just have to get reps with the deck to find what the number is. The number is clearly higher than it is out of the box, but it's one of the things that's, in my experience, you just got to grind it till you like find what that right comfort level number is.
Absolutely. And like you said, it's definitely not going to be the same for every deck. Let's move on to another example here, also a recent commander. The numbers on this one are a lot different than the numbers we just looked at for Gavi.
Yeah, we're looking at Winona Joyner of Forces, the human warrior from the recent Ikoria set. Whenever a non-human creature you control attacks, look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may put a human creature card from among them onto the battlefield tapped and attacking, and it gains indestructible till end of turn. Put the rest of the cards in the bottom of your library in a random order. So you're digging out human creature tokens and putting them into play. It's an interesting deck in that an average of 28 cards in this deck produce non-human creature tokens. So the second half of this is there's an average of 26 humans Winona can flip into to play for free. So you're generating non-human creature tokens that enable you to get as many triggers as possible to flip into humans. So you're trying to get that balance between having cards you can hit based on the trigger and having things that will generate you non-human creature tokens that will enable the trigger in the first place.
Yeah, and something interesting too is that you're playing on average about 9 non-human creatures that do make other non-human tokens that we're talking about here. So stuff like Krenko, Tin Street Goblin, or Goblin Rabblemaster that make armies of tokens on their own. And then that then fuels to get more triggers from Winona to flip into those creatures. So it's a interesting balance. We talked about that balance on our set review where we weren't quite sure what that ratio was and how that deck building challenge would work, because then you can also flip, just a regular 1/1 Goblin token into an Aurelia and get all your combat steps too, which is going to get more triggers. So
I think Aurelia is an angel, not a human, so it wouldn't be flipped in. But yeah, no, that is really interesting, because there's an average of like 35 creatures in the Winona deck, but only 26 are actually humans. So there are a lot more creatures in the deck that are not humans that I wouldn't have expected to see there, to be honest.
Well, the non-humans tend to be things that enable you to win with the things you have out, like the Krenko and the Aurelia, because they do something with a combat step that generates more damage. But you have to find that balance, because if you have too many of those in the deck, you can't actually get the appropriate triggers you want. There's a real juggling act to find that perfect balance there, and it's interesting to see how many cards people are going with, what the actual density of humans is in this deck.
Well, and it's interesting that a whole quarter of the deck are creatures that you can flip into, and being able to dig 6 cards deep isn't a small number. I would like to see it pushed up a little bit more than 26, but I don't think that's a bad number to have that you're looking to just to start with.
Right. It's just so interesting compared to the previous commander we just looked at. The shift was very different. We had over 40 cycling setup cards and then about 10 payoff cards. And here we've got numbers that are a lot closer together, about 28 cards that can produce tokens and then 26 humans that those tokens can help you find and play for free. Those numbers are a lot closer together. And I think that really speaks to the deck building constraint that Winona is under, especially because a lot of the cards that produce non-human tokens are also humans themselves. Cards like Geist Honored Monk, for example, or Lena Selfless Champion, humans that produce non-human tokens. So it's funny because these are two different halves of the deck, but they do sometimes crop up on the same actual cards.
The additional thing with Winona, why you want to maintain this density is the more times you generate that trigger and bring creatures out and into play, the thinner your deck gets with targets that can actually hit. So right. The numbers that work, on turn 4 or 5 when you first attack might not work quite so well on turn 7 or 8 or turn 10 or 12, depending on how many times you've done it. So this one is really, really tricky because you're dealing with ratios that are going to shift quite severely over the course of the game.
Yeah, that's absolutely one of my fears with Winona as well.
Yeah,
because there are a lot of other commanders out there that don't have the same deck building restraint. I'll use Xyrus the Writhing Storm as an example here. Actually, Xyrus can produce like 21 tokens by casting a single Windfall, and that doesn't affect any of the other ratios in its own deck. And it only had to play 1 card, and it didn't require a huge deck building loophole to get there. And so that's the kind of thing that I look at and I see Winona and I'm like, ooh, this requires a lot more hoops. And a single board wipe really changes the math on that. That's the kind of thing that makes me a bit more trepidatious about Winona, I guess. I am still, I know that I had a pretty negative take on Winona in our set review, but I still am hoping to be proven wrong because I think that cheating stuff into play for free is definitely a thing that Joey likes to see, to be honest.
I mean, it is bannably good in standard and in historic, yeah. Well, it's one of the reasons that Agent of Treachery got banned out of standard. Granted, there's several decks that are breaking Agent of Treachery, but Winona certainly was not helping the things. But yes, Dana's point is 100% on point, I should say, that it is a very finite resource for Winona targets. So you want to make sure that you have some way to actually get targets back in from the graveyard, maybe, which is definitely something to keep in mind when building the deck. But we're going to move on real quick to a commander that I do, but I don't want to talk about, and that is Brawl, Chief of Compliance. Now, Brawl is 1 and a blue for a 1/3 that says instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and whenever a spell or ability you control counters a spell, you may draw a card, and if you do, discard a card. So this obviously is all about counter spells, which is going to be the first half of the deck we talk about, the counter spells. On average, a Brawl deck is running about 21 counter spells, and then that second half is finding a way to win the game, actually, just lethal damage. So there's typically about 6 cards that, reliably can win the game when Brawl has kind of taken over. You have stuff like Shark Typhoon, which is that new big Sharknado, making all sorts of shark tokens. Metallurgic Summonings, kind of doing the same thing, making a bunch of tokens upon casting spells. But also Thassa's Oracle, because that's a card that people have started to pay attention to lately. So it's an interesting balance of how many counter spells you're playing in a deck where the commander only wants to be countering other spells.
Now, these numbers are especially interesting to me because, yeah, looking through a Brawl deck, you see a whole lot of control in the deck and a lot of the other cards that fulfill the roles of, mana rocks or making sure you can draw cards and keep your hand stocked and stuff like that. But there were very, very, very few legitimately, this card is intended to make sure I win the game cards in a Brawl deck. And yeah, even Brawl himself can technically attack for lethal damage, but that's a very slow proposition compared to the very obvious win condition cards like Shark Typhoon and stuff like that. But yeah, just 6 cards on average that were specifically intended to help Brawl really take control and make it lethal. That is a very tiny number.
Yeah, I would expect, actually, as much as I hate to say this, It's not the fun thing to say, but the Brawl deck, only 21 counterspells actually seems kind of low to me. I do like the types of win conditions that people seem to be playing. Shark Typhoon and Metallurgic Summonings, like we said, they reward you for casting a lot of non-creature spells. Granted, you're typically going to be making an army of 3/3s, 2/2s, maybe some 4/4s, but that'll get the job done eventually. I think that win conditions, though, in a control deck, and maybe this is just me not being a control player at heart, I want to see more win conditions in any deck, whether it's control, whatever it is.
Yeah, I get that impulse, but I also feel like I know why it doesn't need as many as some others, especially because the ability of Brawl helps you dig and find more cards. You don't need as many if your deck is going to be consistently playing a long game. You're more likely to draw into those cards, especially if your commander helps you dig for them. So you don't need as high of a density of them, because once you've established control, just one condition will do the job. So you don't need to, pack your deck with a ton of cards that don't help you counter spells and remove your opponent's threats like you need to do to control the board. So I do totally get it, but it is still a low number. And that's a good thing to keep in mind when you're playing a controlling deck like that, is to make sure you know how many of those win conditions you have, because it probably isn't very many, which means they're very important, and timing them is even more important too.
Well, yeah, and this kind of comes back to a form of card advantage that we've talked about a couple times in the past, but card velocity, being able to go through your deck and how quickly you can get to specific cards that you need. So like here, you don't need very many win conditions in a Brawl deck, kind of like what you might need with Gavi decks. You have a lot of card velocity, as in you're able to see a lot of different cards each game, which maximizes your chances of seeing any given win condition that you need. I did kind of underestimate this, and then found with my Riel deck, for example, I don't need that many win conditions, because with Riel's ability of whenever I discard a card for the first time in that turn, I then draw that many cards. I see a lot of cards, because not only am I discarding cards to loot effects, but I'm drawing even more. So yeah, I do get it. Maybe this is just me, needing to experience a Brawl deck, which I'm not sure anybody needs to experience a Brawl deck. But I do get where you're coming from, Joey. And yes, I have experienced that myself even.
Yeah, it's really interesting stuff there. Let's see what our next sample commander, what those numbers look like. Dana, who's our next one?
The next one is Ynet Cryptic Sovereign, the legendary Sphinx from Commander 2018. Ynet has 11 or 12 different keywords, but what's important there is whenever Ynet Cryptic Sovereign attacks, reveal the top card of your library, and if that card's CMC is odd, you may cast it without paying its mana cost, otherwise draw a card. So the first half here is top deck manipulation, and on average we're looking at 16 different cards that set up the top of the deck. Things like Sensei's Divining Top, or Halimar Depths, Brainstorm, Cavalier of Gales, Amanatu, Soothsaying. Basically anything that lets you stack what you're going to reveal when you get the attack from Amanatu.
From Ynet.
From Ynet.
Yeah.
The second half here are the odd cards that you're looking to cheat into play. So things like Emrakul, the Promised End, or Magister Sphinx, or Void Winnower, or Angel of Despair. Things with a high CMC that you're going to get to just play for free by conveniently arranging it so they're on the top of your library every time you get a swing.
And how many was that?
25 of those cheats versus 16 setup cards.
Now, this one's especially interesting, and this is kind of a hard number to get, because we couldn't obviously include every odd CMC card that shows up in the average Ynet list. We weren't going to count stuff like Mole Drifter, even though that is technically a card that Ynet can cheat into play, but definitely those bigger payoffs, the Angel of Despairs, the Eldrazi that Ynet can cheat into play. This one's very interesting because the numbers actually go the opposite way. There's not as much setup as there are the payoff cards that Ynet can cheat in.
Well, one of the reasons I would guess for that is these kind of setup cards don't necessarily stack. So you can hit a situation where you play that Halimar Depths that lets you rearrange the top 3 cards of your library, and your Sensei's Divining Top that does the exact same thing doesn't necessarily work. Those don't work together well. You're doing the same thing over again. So if you have too many of those effects that don't let you scry to the bottom of your library, or like at least Brainstorm does let you put something from your hand on top of your library, you're dealing with things that are redundant and basically don't work.
Yeah, you don't need a Sensei's Divining Top while you also have a Soothsaying out, for example. So yeah, it is true. You only need one of those 16 cards in play to really take effect. And I think just accuracy by volume when it comes to payoff cards like this. Like eventually you're going to hit something super crazy to pay off. And sometimes those setup cards are part of the payoffs. That's not ideal, but you're still getting something.
Yeah, it's really interesting stuff, especially what you've pointed out there, Dana, that those cards don't stack well with each other. And that's, a thing that we don't see, for example, in the Winona deck, where all of those tokens are actually, the more of them that you have, definitely the better. So that is kind of an interesting thing to observe here too. Yes, those do all synergize with what the commander is up to, which is definitely what we're interested in seeing here. They all can help with setup, but sometimes those categories within the deck also fight against the other cards within that same category. And that's something that's definitely worth noting so that you can find the right number when you're putting in reps with that deck. There's one more here that I want to get to as well, because this is a commander that actually has sort of 3 pieces to its setup. I think that you guys already know where I'm going with this. I just want to talk about reanimation. Let's talk about the Mimoplasm. This is my absolute, my bay of a commander. It is a 5-mana Sultai commander. It's a 0/0 ooze, but it's just so good. This is it's the best.
Just
I know
tell us what the commander is, Joey.
But I'm reveling in its T-Rex arm. As the Mimoplasm enters the battlefield, you may exile 2 creature cards from graveyards. If you do, it enters the battlefield as a copy of one of those cards with additional +1 counters equal to the power of the other card. And the setup and payoff that we've got in a Mimoplasm deck is a little bit funky, actually, because it has 3 steps. Section 1, you need cards that will help you fill the yard up, either by discarding or tutoring them directly into your graveyard. Cards like Buried Alive or Life's Finale or Windfall. And the average Mimoplasm deck, it has about 14 cards in that particular category. Section 2, you need some reanimator spells. Obviously, Mimoplasm is a reanimator effect itself, but then there's also stuff like Animate Dead. Body Double can also, get you a creature from the graveyard, or Living Death, which is my absolute favorite, get you all of those back. There are an average of 13 or so reanimation effects in a Mimoplasm deck. And then Section 3, you need the creatures that you're going to reanimate, the actual targets. And there are about 15 of these in a Mimoplasm deck. That's stuff like Jin-Gitaxias or Terastodon, or Mimoplasm's particular favorite targets, such as becoming a copy of Skithiryx or getting extra additional counters on it equal to the power of that Lord of Extinction in your graveyard. Really awesome stuff. But this is just one other thing that I wanted to linger on here, because this is the type of thing that really has a couple of steps to get that payoff, and they all fit within that synergy umbrella, but they each definitely have very distinct roles.
They have distinct roles, and part of the problem with balancing those roles is if you lean too heavily into one category, the other ones don't necessarily support it. If you are leaning really heavily into big beater reanimation targets, that's going to then pull away the reanimation spells you have access to. You're going to have less of those, which means you're going to have less opportunities to do things with those big creatures in your graveyard. Conversely, right. If you have a ton of reanimation spells, you're going to probably have less reanimation targets, giving you that opportunity to wind up with the Animate Dead and the Necromancy in hand and nothing in your graveyard. So there's a lot of things to balance here, and they really kind of fight one another if you have the balance wrong.
Exactly. That's what's so interesting about this category, about seeing what sets up and what pays off, because too many in one category means that your deck doesn't do the thing that it wants to do at all. And I love how even these numbers are. You've got 14 cards that help fill the yard, 13 that specifically reanimate cards, and then about 15 targets that you want to reanimate. Those are very even numbers. It's not like a 40 and a 10 or a 20 and a 6. It's very, very even across the board. And that's a really important lesson, I think, for those reanimated players out there like me, who like to do really disgusting stuff with their graveyard.
Now, the one pressure relief valve, so to speak, here for all of this is Mimoplasm can hit other people's graveyards. So if you happen to get not lucky and don't have the right things in your yard to hit, you might have something you could take from somebody else. Similarly, some of the reanimation spells Black has don't rely on hitting your own graveyard either. So if you happen to just have the balance wrong or just get unlucky, you can reanimate something someone else has. So there is a bit of kind of a backup there. You're not hard locked to just being out of luck if your balance is wrong or you just have some poor draws. That does help with this particular deck, whereas the rest of the ones we've discussed, it's entirely on you.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to linger on that one because Reanimator is the best, and I thought the numbers were really cool. But now we've got a couple of other archetypes we want to look at as well. But before we get to that part of the show, we have to do one of our favorite segments, challenging the stats. There's so much data on EDHREC, but we don't always agree with it. Sometimes we think that cards are seeing too much play, and sometimes they're seeing too little play. So what we like to do is challenge those statistics. Matt, how about for this week? You start us off. What is your challenge?
Well, my challenge comes to us courtesy of Nick Ross. One of the listeners sent us an email with a interesting challenge of stats that I really actually appreciated. So Myriad Landscape is the card we're going to talk about today. It is just a land, enters the battlefield tapped, and you can tap it to add a colorless mana to your mana pool, or you can pay 2 and tap it and sacrifice it to search your library for up to 2 basic land cards that share a land type and put them on the battlefield. Well, what Nick is challenging here specifically is in colorless decks. So currently, Myriad Landscape is being played in 17% of Ulamog, the Ceaseless Hunger decks, and 30% of Emrakul, the Promised End decks. The problem is that in those colorless decks, you can't really activate Myriad Landscape because wastes don't share a land type. There is no land type to those. It's not a forest or a plains or anything like that. It's just a basic land. So what Myriad Landscape basically becomes is an enter the battlefield tapped basic land that doesn't do anything. And I think that number in Ulamog, Ceaseless Hunger decks, in those Emrakul Promised End decks, is much, much too high because it basically is a worse waste in all those decks. Blasted Landscape is a substitute I think people should be playing that's only showing up on 37% of all colorless decks right now, which is just a enter the battlefield, you can tap it for a colorless, or you can cycle it away. Those are the types of cards that I really like instead of Myriad Landscape, because in a colorless deck, you can't ever get any lands out of your deck with it, and it's just strictly a better, or a worse, I should say, waste in those colorless decks. So good call, Nick Ross. You're not quite Rick Ross, but you're pretty dang close with this pick.
That is an absolutely great. That is not the kind of thing that I would have noticed even, because it's just like, this gets me to the basic lands, right? That's what Myriad Landscape does. That's such an intuitive thing to do, but they don't have basic land types, so it can't get those. Oh man, yeah, that means it's definitely played too much.
Yes.
All right, Dana, how about you?
I also have a challenge this week sent to us by a listener, LexB10823 on Twitter. Praetor's Grasp. And that's a sorcery spell for 1 and 2 black. Search target opponent's library for a card and exile it face down. Then that player shuffles his or her library. You may look at and play that card as long as it remains exiled. It's not a card that sees a ton of play in EDH, but it's being suggested to be played more in King Makar the Gold Cursed decks, where right now it's in less than 1% of decks. King Makar, when he attacks, whenever he becomes untapped, you may exile a creature, and if you do, you put a colorless artifact token named Gold onto the battlefield. So King Makar makes gold tokens that can be sacrificed to add a mana of any color to your mana pool. That's irrelevant here because Praetor's Grasp doesn't let you pay mana of any color to cast the spells you get with it. King Makar, however, makes tokens that let you cast those spells, and you can go get spells that do things that black doesn't have access to. You can't destroy artifacts in black for the most part. You can't destroy enchantments. So Praetor's Grasp winds up kind of being a wild card where if you absolutely need to deal with that doubling season or that wound reflection or something that's going to end the game if you don't get rid of it, you can use Praetor's Grasp to go get that Naturalize and actually be able to cast it with green mana because of the gold tokens.
That's really clever. I really like that.
Yeah.
And to honor this, I've actually also got a Challenge Stats pick that was provided by a listener. So
Nice.
guys, we were on a wavelength. We absolutely were. And our listeners are providing some really cool suggestions. This one comes to us from Mia Hammer via email. This one took me a second to realize, but I really like her train of thought here. So Mia says, now I'm all for janky cards finding homes, but I feel like Triskaidekaphobia doesn't have a lot of synergy with Selenia. So Selenia Dark Angel is an Orzhov commander, 5 mana 3/3 with flying, who lets you pay 2 life to return her to your hand. But the way that colon is placed, the way that you can activate Selenia's ability, you can actually pay a bunch of life before that ability resolves. So she lets you manipulate your life total really really, really, really efficiently. So you can go all the way down to 2 or 1 life, and then use some effects like Axis of Mortality, for instance, to swap that low life total with someone else. It's a really clever strategy. But the card that we're looking at here is Triskaidekaphobia, and that is the 4-mana enchantment that at the beginning of your upkeep you choose one. Either everyone gains a life or loses a life, and then anyone who has exactly 13 life loses the game. The idea is probably to use those life swap effects to use Selenia to set your life total to 13 and then change it over to someone else so that Triskaidekaphobia will, make them lose the game. But what Mia tells us is Selenia's only interaction with Trisk by itself is sort of keeping yourself from losing. And in my book, not losing to your own win con is kind of a stretch on what the term synergy encompasses. You still need other effects like Axis of Mortality or Soul Conduit to actually make Selenia's ability kill your opponents. But at that point, you might as well just go with the plan of setting your own life total to 1 or 2 and then switching it over, because that's basically lethal anyway. I was actually pretty into this pick. It does seem like Triskaidekaphobia, you could just, instead of setting to 13 and giving your life total away, you could just set it to 1 and then they're basically dead anyway, right? What do you guys think?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, Triskaidekaphobia is a card that requires a lot of work to get just right.
Yes.
If that is your jam, God bless. I'm not going to tell you how to do your business, but I certainly am not up to that type of challenge anyways. So it's going to be in 0% of Matt Morgan decks for perpetuity.
Yeah, and it's also the kind of card that someone can manipulate themselves to get out of it fairly easily. There's enough things that allow you to pay life at will. I don't love it either necessarily, so I'm kind of with Matt there.
Yeah. With Matt, with Dana, with Mia, this is, man, listeners providing awesome challenges stats pick.
Yeah.
This is why it's my favorite part of the show. But let's move back into that main topic, because we don't want to just look at specific commanders. We actually kind of want to zoom out a little bit and compare some commanders within certain archetypes. We were just talking about Selenia, who was sort of a black-white life gain commander. Let's look at the life gain strategy and compare 2 commanders from within that strategy and see what their setup ratios and their payoff ratios are like from across those 2 different ones. Matt, do you mind starting us off?
So the first one we're going to talk about in this life gain category of ours is going to be Oloro Ageless Ascetic. So Oloro is 3 in Esper colors, so a white, a blue, and a black for a 4/5 legendary giant soldier. At the beginning of your upkeep, you gain 2 life. And whenever you gain life, you may pay 1, and if you do, you draw a card, each opponent loses a life. But then the important part is, at the beginning of your upkeep, if Oloro is in the command zone, you then gain 2 life. So it's all about gaining life, sitting there, elongating the game, making sure you get all sorts of value from the preeminence, because it wasn't quite eminence when Oloro was printed, but it has that ability out of the command zone. So on average, the life gainers, or different cards that are going to gain you life in an Oloro deck, they're playing about 16 of those cards, whether it's something like Authority of the Consuls to gain you life, or Wall of Reverence to gain big bumps, or even Comball, Console of Allocation, that taxes everybody and makes sure you're gaining a steady stream of life throughout the game. So it might be a little low there, but the second half of this deck that we're going to be talking about is weaponizing that life gain. How are you going to use the life that you have accrued over the course of the game into actually winning? So on average, there are 13 of these cards in an Oloro deck, whether it's Aetherflux Reservoir, where you can pay 50 life and hit somebody for 50 life. That's quite the ability there, but also cards like Felidar Sovereign that just outright win you the game. The typical deck also ends up playing stuff like Exquisite Blood and the Sanguine Bond combo, where if you gain 1 life, everybody else loses a life, and it just turns into this never-ending loop of gaining life and everybody else losing life. This also includes different cards that can kind of supplement that, like Vizkopa or Defiant Bloodlord, that also fill in those certain roles. What do you guys think about the ratios here of 16 life gain cards and then 13 life gain payoff cards?
It's so low. That's my first thought. These are really low numbers.
It's low, but I think part of this is because Oloro doesn't necessarily signpost to you that that's how you're going to win, is with life gain. So I think there's probably a higher amount of people than you usually see with these kind of archetypal decks who aren't leaning into life gain as their win condition. I think that's probably mucking with their stats a little bit.
I suppose, but also the fact that Oloro is a life gainer allows it to run fewer of the cards that let you gain life. And that's why we wanted to compare it to another life gain commander. So also in the same archetype of life gain, Karlov of the Ghost Council. This is a really cool commander. He is very cheap, just 2 mana for a 2/2. Whenever you gain life, he gets 2+1 counters, and you can pay a white and a black and remove 6 of those counters from Karlov to exile a creature. His numbers in those two different categories of how many cards in the deck gain you life and how many cards actually help you, turn that life gain into something lethal, they're very different from Oloro. Karlov has 35 life gain outlets, and this includes some of the same cards that we mentioned for Oloro, but also stuff like Soul's Warden and Soul's Attendant, which gains you life whenever creatures enter the battlefield, Sunscorch Regent, which gains you life when other players cast spells. There are 35 of those. And then the second half of weaponizing the life gain, there are only 9 cards that specifically make the life gain lethal. A lot of the same ones, like Felidar Sovereign, the same stuff that Oloro is running, but then of course also including Karlov himself, because he can deal lethal commander damage if you've gained a whole bunch of life. He gets really, really big. This is my stepdad's deck. It crushes me all the time. It's really, really powerful. It's awesome. But like, those numbers are just totally, totally different than what we saw for Oloro. Oloro had very low but pretty even. And then Karlov has so many cards that help with the set off and a lot fewer that are the payoff.
Well, and I think that's kind of due to the nature of the commanders too, where Oloro, even in the command zone, is gaining you life, which takes a lot of the pressure off needing other cards in your deck to gain you the life. Whereas Karlov has 35 life gain cards. Oloro doesn't need that many because no matter where Oloro is, you're gaining life every turn. So that puts the precipice on, or excuse me, the importance on putting more payoff cards into the Oloro deck, whereas Karlov is that payoff where Oloro was the life gain. So the role of the commanders is swapped a little bit. So I think that's why their ratios might be leaning the way they are. Plus Oloro, like we said about Brawl, it's a control deck. You're elongating the game. You're going to see cards. Plus there's blue in there, which means you're going to be drawing a decent amount of cards. So I think that's why Oloro, you say it's low playing 13 payoff cards, but chances are they're going to be able to find the right one at the right time, just knowing the type of deck that Oloro is and playing blue in there. Whereas Karlov's such a low cost, you can kind of play him, gain a little bit of your life, and then use his ability probably pretty quickly after you play him.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just really important to see those different numbers, I think, because it tells you how much the commander plays such a huge role in how much attention you have to give to each of those different parts of your deck, which section within that synergy umbrella that you need to pay the most attention to based off of whether your commander is an enabler or your commander is a payoff. And that's just really, really fascinating. And we've got a couple of other examples too. Let's move on to some examples within the wheel strategy in EDH.
So the wheels, the first commander we're going to talk about here is Yrus the Writhing Storm. It's one of the new commanders from Commander 2020. It is the Teamer commander. It's 2 and a green, blue, and a red for a 3/5 Snake Leviathan with flying. Whenever an opponent draws a card except the first card they would draw in each of their draw steps, you create a 1/1 green snake creature token, and then whenever Yrus the Writhing Storm deals combat damage to a player, you and that player draw that many cards. So Yrus hits for 3, you both draw 3. Yrus hits for 10, you both draw 10, and then you're making that many 1/1s all the way along. So the two halves of the deck here are going to be 15 wheel cards. That is cards like Windfall, Reforge the Soul, stuff that's going to be discarding a lot of cards and then drawing that many or more. And then you're going to have 10 Howling Mine type of effects. So that is cards like Howling Mine or Font of Mythos, where you draw extra cards every draw step. So on average, you're looking at about 25 cards that are going to be forcing people to be drawing more cards. So that puts us then into the payoff cards. What are those payoff cards? So there's about 13 payoff cards in the average Yrus deck, whether that's Locust God yet again, stuff like Shared Animosity, which makes all your 1/1 snakes very, very powerful in combat, or even Perforos and Impact Tremors, which every time one of those creature tokens comes in the battlefield, you're doming the entire table. So it's interesting to see that little navigation between the 25 drawing cards and helping opponents draw cards to only 13 payoff cards for those creature tokens being created. What do you guys think about these ratios right here?
I expected this to have a lot fewer payoffs, I think, because Yrus plays such a huge role, but then also because a wheel deck, like you mentioned the card velocity, Matt, they go through so many cards that it would make sense to me that you will find one of those things eventually. But in thinking about that, it actually is probably a little bit foolish because this deck probably doesn't want to cast a whole lot of the wheel spells until it actually gets one of those payoffs in play. So getting a high density of them would be really necessary, because otherwise the setup cards just benefit your opponent way too much and you don't want to cast them.
Yeah, I know Dana is not a big fan of Wheel of Fortune type effects. So yeah, helping your opponents and not really doing anything yourself, you probably do want to make sure you have something in place before you start firing off all those wheel spells.
Well, in Joey, you just talked about how you probably don't want to wheel unless you have one of the payoffs in hand, which requires more of them. That makes an interesting comparison to our other wheel commander here, which is Nekuzar the Mindraiser. Nekuzar is a zombie wizard. At the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws an additional card, and whenever an opponent draws a card, Nekuzar the Mindraiser deals 1 damage to that player. So unlike the Yrus Thriving Storm we just talked about, the Punisher here is actually on the commander, so you don't necessarily need to wait until you have the payoff card out to start wheeling. And you see it in the stats here. There are 31 forced draw spells here, most of the same ones that Yrus has, plus additional ones in black like Whispering Madness. And then you only have 16 Punishers. I shouldn't say 16, that's still a decent amount, but there are 16 Punishers here because the Punisher is right there on the commander when you cast it.
Yeah, and those are, of course, the things like Migrum or Spiteful Visions, Underworld Dreams, really punishing people for drawing cards. Both of these are slightly bigger than the numbers we just looked at for Yrus. Yrus had 25 enablers and 13 lethal payoffs, and then Nekuzar had a little bit more, 31 of those forcing to draw, and then slightly more, 16 of the punishing effects. Basically, though, I think that this just sort of signals that the wheel strategy is not quite as... I don't know, since both of those commanders are both kind of payoffs, or can both be, making those wheel effects lethal, it makes sense that their strategies are going to be a bit more consistent. So a wheel strategy, I think you can more reliably count on these numbers to be a good indication of where you want your own numbers to be for your own deck.
I think there is something to be said, too, for Yrus is fairly new, only having coming out in the past few months, whereas Nekuzar has been out for a very long time. So Nekuzar decks are pretty well fleshed out. The data is pretty concrete, whereas Yrus, people are still kind of playing around with it a little bit. So I don't know if these numbers are the same as what they would be, in a year or so. I think there might be some new cards that are going to kind of get fleshed out, and just the nature of having black in the deck versus green to combine with the blue and the red. That's another interesting thing too, and how well you can draw cards based off of what colors you're playing as part of the commander identity within the same theme.
Yeah.
Well, not only is Yrus new, it's a card that was released in an environment where it's been difficult to find games to play just because of many places under quarantine and social distancing rules, etc. So there's probably less games than you normally would see from this deck getting played, leading to them probably being slightly less tuned than you would even normally see for a deck that's new anyway.
Yeah.
Plus, black has the access to tutors, so I'm not really sure. I think
that throws it off too.
You could play less Punisher effects in Nekuzar because you can just tutor for the exact one that you want at any given time. That's probably not irrelevant as well.
Oh, yeah, that's a thing that I hadn't quite thought of, but that's certainly a way that you could play it. You don't need as many if you can find them pretty easily. Yeah, that totally makes sense. But it's just interesting to see that those numbers are a bit more consistent compared to the wheel strategy, where those two compared to the life gain strategy, where those commanders definitely fulfilled different types of roles. So again, just going back to how these commanders really do affect the numbers and the types of cards that you want supporting the deck. And let's cap it off with one final example. Let's talk about a little bit of landfall and see what the numbers within the deck look like for two different landfall commanders.
Well, you said landfall, so I'm going to chime in, of course. Omnath Locus of Rage, one of my favorite decks, probably my oldest living deck, actually. I'm going to throw this into the ring. So 3 red, red, green, green for a 5/5 legendary elemental. Has landfall ability. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you create a 5/5 elemental creature token, which is awesome, but also has the ability of whenever Omnath Locus of Rage or another elemental you control dies, Omnath deals 3 damage to any target. That is also an awesome ability. So obviously the first half of this deck is going to be ramp cards. You want as many lands on the battlefield and then some more lands, because obviously once you get Omnath into play, you don't want the party to stop, do you? So 30 average ramp cards. That's going to be cards like Boundless Realms, Perilous Forays, but then also some extra land type of effects, Exploration, Burgeoning. Those are also very good ones. And then a few even graveyard specific land ramp cards like Ramanap Excavator. So if we count fetch lands, this number does go up to 37 as far as getting extra triggers, but typically about 30 is what we would consider the traditional land ramp. So the second half of the deck is going to be landfall payoff cards. So cards that benefit from getting more lands into the battlefield, kind of like Omnath. So on average, you're seeing about 13 payoff cards in Omnath Locus of Rage decks, whether this is Joey's favorite elemental ever, Titania, the mono green Titania that makes all sorts of creature tokens, in addition to the tokens you're already getting, or even
She's beautiful.
Quite the haymaker too, Warstorm Surge, that further benefits you from getting more of those Omnath tokens into play. 4 of these kind of payoff cards aren't really win conditions necessarily. There are things like Tireless Tracker that benefit, or Lotus Cobra. So there are a few that don't quite get there as far as winning you the game, but they are key to the strategy. But 13 is the number that we consider the payoff cards for having those landfall triggers coming on.
Well, and we talked earlier about the Ynet deck, where the top deck manipulation tended to not stack, so you didn't want too many of those. Well, this is the opposite situation here, where ramp is obviously good early in the game to get you ahead with other people, but then after that point, ramp is just what enables your deck to do what it's doing. So you can go really, really deep on things that ramp you and lands in this deck, because it's always, always good at every point in the game, no matter how many of those you have access to.
Yep.
I will say there is a bit of an issue, sort of like we saw with Winona, though, where this does eat in a little bit to the ratios left within the deck. I'm pretty sure that every landfall player out there has had the experience where you cast some Skyshroud Claim and you realize you're out of forests in the deck for you to go and fetch, which is that makes the graveyard synergies, the Crucible of World effects, so much more important for decks like that, to make sure that you can still get landfall drops even after you run out of things in the deck. But that is just kind of funny too, to see that occasionally that does mess with the numbers a little bit. So play more basics, people. Play more basics.
I'll say this, Joey.
That's my line, Joey.
I have a mindendek deck that started off as kind of a landfall deck, and over the years I've pushed it more into a lands matter deck, something that cares about having multiple lands in play, having an amount of lands versus landfall triggers, just for that reason, because I hit enough points where I ran out of lands I could go get to get the landfall triggers, and the balance became really difficult to keep up with, so I chose to deal with it by not dealing with it and just kind of removing most of the landfall stuff and going with a lands matters theme instead.
Yeah, well, exactly.
There is nothing worse than playing a Perilous Forays and getting all your basics into play, and then you draw Rampant Growth, you're like, well, poop.
Well, shoot. Well, and that's just it. Dana, you mentioned that the ratios, the strategy, it had to shift a bit when you had a different type of landfall commander. So I'll compare the numbers that we just saw for Omnath to an old favorite of mine was Lord Windgrace. This was the Jund Planeswalker commander, 5 mana, 5 loyalty. You can add 2 loyalty to discard a card and draw a card, and you draw 2 if you discarded a land. It can also -3 to return lands from your graveyard to the battlefield, and it has a -11 ultimate ability to destroy 6 permanents and then create cat tokens in their place, which is really, really cool. The numbers are a bit different here. The ramp effects, we've got sort of near the same. It's about 27 cards that help you with extra land drops. So, you know, all those ramp cards, Harrow and Skyshroud Claims and all of those, but then also the extra land drop cards like Oracle of Moldiah, all the classics, basically. But then the second half, we have a very increased number of cards that make those landfall into something lethal landfall, because you got 19 of them. This is stuff like Omnath, who's showing up in the average deck, or cards like Field of the Dead can also get lethal if you have a lot of lands. That's a whole lot of zombies. Retreat to Hagra is another one I really enjoyed when I was playing Lord Windgrace, because that drains people whenever you get landfall effects. You've got 19 of those cards that make your lands lethal, which is a bit more than Omnath, because Omnath himself fulfills that role so well, so he doesn't need as many of them.
Yep, it's kind of like the ratios we talked about between Oloro and Karlov, where once the payoff is stapled onto your commander, that takes a little bit of the need to put those into the 99. Also probably why Omnath Locus of Rage shows up in the 99 of Lord Windgrace decks, because it is such a good payoff card. So just shifting it to the command zone is why you can pay more cards that just feed into the strategy versus trying to fill it with the payoff cards.
All right, guys, so after looking at all of these individual commanders or comparing and contrasting some commanders within certain strategies, what are your final thoughts on your deck's ratio within that synergy umbrella? How many cards you feel a deck needs to set up the strategy, how many it needs for payoffs? What are some overall observations from all the stuff that we looked at today?
Early on you talked about ratios. You want this many lands roughly and this many removal spells and this many draw spells. And I think more or less that's mostly true in most decks. You are going to be tweaking it based on, flavoring to taste, so to speak. But you are going to want those kind of spells in decks. I think this is much more fluid based on what your commander is doing. I just can't generically give you a breakdown that's going to more or less work for you with slight tweaks unless I know what commander you're talking about. So you just have to look at your commander, and maybe you can look at a place like EDHREC for guidelines about what that number breakdown should be, but it's going to be pretty significantly different from commander to commander to commander. You just have to kind of figure it out.
That's also, I'm also very hesitant about the idea of deck building templates because they are a great way to get someone started. But if you cling to them too much, then you might actually miss the points where deviating from those is going to help you out quite a lot. Because as we saw, the role that the commander plays within the deck has a big impact on how often people are playing cards that help that commander do its thing and help that commander make the strategy lethal. Very different parts of the deck, and paying attention to not just the umbrella of synergy, but also the different components within that umbrella is also really important to make sure that the deck runs smoothly and that you don't ever run out of gas, or that you don't wind up with too many win conditions and then they're all fighting for space, because that's actually kind of another thing. Too many win con cards can mean, like, you don't want to devote too many of them onto the board. I don't want to play a Rampaging Baloth and an Omnath and a Retreat to Hagra necessarily. That seems like a little bit of overkill. If someone plays a board wipe, all of my win conditions went out the window, so maybe having fewer of them. And that's something that we saw when we looked at all of those. I think Ynet was the only exception, but most of the commanders that we talked about had significantly more setup cards than they had payoff cards.
I also think the last important factor here, Joey, talking about hesitant to give someone a template, the big X factor that we oftentimes don't talk about is personal play style as well. How one person pilots a deck is going to make a difference with what those balances are compared to somebody else as well. And that's nothing we can even comment on. Like, I have no idea what another party is going to do that's different from what I do. I don't even know what I'm going to do sometimes, like what my own personal play style is going to be. I certainly can't strategize for what yours is going to be.
Oh, man.
And I do agree that having a template is a very, very good place to start, because everybody has to start, and Commander honestly can be very overwhelming for people. So I understand the need to give somebody a square one. Here's the very, very basics. But then knowing kind of, once you get comfortable, where to take any given commander and then kind of take that personal understanding to the next level. And one of those things for me, at least, is understanding kind of what is enabling your payoff cards. Is it pure card draw? Is it wheels? Is it cycling? That usually means you're going to be able to see a lot more cards in a given game. And so just those types of decks are going to need less payoff cards than something that relies on pure card quality versus drawing a bunch of cards every game. So Omnath, you're probably going to need a decent amount of win conditions in there, or Lord Windgrace, like we saw, compared to the cycling decks, compared to the wheel decks, because those blue decks, honestly, they're going to be seeing so many more cards just by virtue of drawing more cards over the typical game. Now, green has gotten very, very powerful lately. That might change here soon, who knows? But wheel decks, like we said, you probably don't need as many payoff cards compared to a Lord Windgrace deck, just due to the nature of that. And that's just one thing that you'll start to pick on as you start getting more familiar with different types of commanders.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just the role that your commander plays, but also the type of strategy that you're playing. Like you mentioned with the card velocity, it does mean that maybe you can afford to run fewer. So yeah, and I think also, like, just being flexible with your template, playing around with them, because honestly, doing it wrong, I guess, quote unquote, playing with those ratios and making them incorrect and then playing a game and seeing, all these ratios from the template are completely different. Doing it wrong just to see how important those things are, to reinforce reinforce that lesson for yourself. I'll admit that's something that I do occasionally just to remind myself, yeah, no, these are really important. I do need to make sure that I run this much ramp. I do need to make sure that I have a good enough density of enablers to make sure that the deck does its thing. Because that can just make sure that you remember those good habits and go forward and remember their value, basically. But yeah, it's been really fascinating to look at the different ways that decks will set up their strategies and then pay them off in different fashions, and looking at the numbers there, I think it was a really cool lesson to be able to look at those and make sure that you're criticizing or at least engaging critically with the ways that commanders will do the thing, because there tend to be multiple steps to it, and it's never one thing. It's often several different things that you got to pay attention to, and making sure that you know their ratios, that you know their numbers can really help you get more wins in those games. But with that, I think what we ought to do is call this episode to a close. Thank you guys so much for joining me, and if our listeners would like to get in touch with us, where can they find you all? Matt?
So you can find me on the Twitters at Mathimus55. That's MATHIMUS55. And don't forget, I hear on Wednesday nights, we are streaming games, twitch.tv/EDHRECast. All the great guests, all the great games, and just make sure you tune in.
Awesome. And Dana?
You can find me at my house hiding from small children. And you can find me on the Twitter birds at Dana Roach, and hear me a couple times a week on my other podcast, CMDR Central.
And I'm Joey Schultz. You can find me at Joseph M. Schultz on Twitter. You can find the cast at EDHRECast on Facebook and on Twitter. And if you have a question or an insight to EDHREC's data, or like the challenge to stat segment that we did on this episode, any fun challenges that you have, you can email us at EDHRECast@gmail.com. Our thanks again to Josh Lequai and the whole team at the Command Zone for handling all of the awesome post-production work on the podcast. And of course, we have to give a huge thank you to our sponsors, cardkingdom.com and TCG Player. You can find them using the price info links on EDHREC or by visiting cardkingdom.com/EDHREC, and that shows your support for the show. Don't forget, if you are interested in becoming a writer for EDHREC, you can submit your pitch at edhrec.com/apply, or you can email us at social@edhrec.com. And finally, listeners, what do you think about the ratio between a deck's setup cards and their payoffs? We would love to hear your thoughts on the subject too. We'll be back at you next week with more data and insights, but until then, remember, EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.